Hello everyone, this is Laura from Discovery Fabric Patterns, and today I'm going to show you a little bit about how you can bind your saddle skirt with your domestic machine at home. Once your casing's basted in place, you'll want to finish all the raw edges on your saddle skirt the whole way around. You can bind them with a fold-over elastic. It works very well. It has this nice line down the middle where the fold-over elastic naturally wants to fold, and that's where you line that center line up with the edge of your fabric as you go around the outside of your saddle skirt and stitch it into place, and it'll create this nice clean finished edge. You can use a bright color or sparkles, you can use zebra stripes or subtle black. You can also get continuous binding. So this is a shiny lycra binding. There are also some more matte knit colors available, and it comes in continuous yardage, so you don't have to worry about joining strips. If I line it up with the edge of my fabric right sides together, stitch it about 3/8 of an inch, wrap my binding piece around to the back side, I can then stitch it down and I'll have this nice clean bound edge, and I can do that the whole way around the outside of my piece with one continuous yardage piece. Or if I prefer, I can cut strips. Cutting strips, you can use any lightweight knit fabric and cut it into 1.5 inch wide strips. So here I've cut it with a grid ruler and a rotary cutter. You can always measure your 1.5 inch from either end of your fabric piece, mark it with chalk, and cut it with scissors. That works fine too. Using cut strips is a great way to do a little bit of stash busting, and it also opens up a whole world of colors, prints, and patterns for the edge of your saddle skirt. If I am using cut strips for my binding, I'm going to have to join my strips together. I find the best way to do this is to create an angled join. You want to do that by putting them right sides together at a 90-degree angle to one another, forming this nice square corner, and then I stitch from this point to this point in a diagonal line across the square where they overlap. Then when I open my seam out, you'll see that they join together on this nice angle. I do that because it creates less bulk. Here in this example, I have sewn them together with a straight seam, and you can see when I bring this binding piece around the back, those seam allowances are all stacking one on top of the other, and this can create quite a bulge. If you're using a slightly heavier fabric for your binding, you may also find that your machine will fight you. It may not want to go through that many layers of fabric all at once. So I find all in all it works a little better for me if I join my strips on an angle. You can see the difference here where I've joined them on an angle. When I bring that binding around to the back, my seam allowances are spread over a much greater distance. So they start way over on the right there, and they go all the way over to there. So that spreads those seam allowances over nearly 2 inches of distance and allows my binding to sit a lot flatter. Whether I'm using continuous manufactured binding or cut strips, when I mount it to my fabric, I want to make sure I leave a tail that is longer than my strip is wide. So I've used the other end of my strip here to measure out how long of a tail I will need. In this case, 1.5 inches, because my strips are 1.5 inches wide. And I've mounted the binding strip to the edge of my saddle skirt fabric, right sides together. And when I pop it into the machine here, I'm going to leave a seam allowance of 3/8 of an inch. I want to be under 1/2 inch of seam allowance because I want to make sure that I have enough width in my binding strip to wrap all the way around the back of the fabric and cover up this seam that I am putting in right now. And here I can stitch it down with a simple straight stitch because I'm really not worried about stretch for this garment. When I come back around to this point where I started, there's my pin, making sure I had enough tail. I want to sew my binding strip on right up until it meets the point where I started. So I want my final stitch attaching this binding strip to finish exactly where my first stitch on this started. So I will actually hold that tail out of the way because I want to make sure that I don't stitch my two tails together yet. And then I'm going to use the pin to mark exactly where that stitching line starts and come up to it slowly, and then I actually hand dial my last stitch down and then back stitch to be sure that those two ends of that continuous stitching line meet where you've put your binding on all the way around. And now you can see I have two tails. Both of them are longer than 1.5 inches, and my stitching comes right up to meet. That point where the stitching meets is where I'm going to want to start basting my pieces together. I have them right sides together and I have them turned on a 90-degree angle to one another. And the square where they overlap, I want to stitch corner to corner with a loose basting stitch, just a few sloppy stitches to hold it in place from that point where those two seams meet to the opposite corner if my binding strips are at a 90-degree angle to each other. Now some people will pin this or clip it, and that's fine too, or some people will just hold it in place. I like to baste it because I can leave the basting stitches in while I sew my seam, and I find that it doesn't move around on me as much. So for the few seconds it takes to throw in the basting stitch, I just throw in a quick basting stitch. It also allows me to check the seam placement on this final finish, so I can open it out like that, and before I've done any machine stitching or trimming or anything, I can just double check. Then I can run it through the machine, remove that basting stitch, trim off my excess, clip my corners, and with my seam all cleaned up, I can open up my seam allowance, wrap that binding strip around the edge of my soft shell fabric there, and then I'll stitch from the top side down to secure that back there in place. In this case, because I'm not worried about stretch, I can use a straight stitch. I have it set to a straight stitch at about 2.5. I can use any of these regular stitches, or I can use a stretch stitch. So I turn my machine to its little SS stretch stitch setting, and that gives me access to all the stitches you see in the pictures in blue. So if I set it to a stretch stitch D here, that will give me this stitch. Your machine may be different, but you can always look up your manual online. Here's an example of stitching in the ditch. Here's an example of an edge stitch. Here is that stretch stitch D that I was showing you, which as you can see is wider. So if you're concerned about catching the back edge of your binding fabric, using a wider stitch can be a nice way to make sure you do. Here's another stretch stitch option that my standard machine has. Here it is with a wide zigzag, and here it is with a narrow zigzag. Really, the choice is yours. The other option for finishing the edges on your saddle skirt is fold over elastic. It can be really helpful with fold over elastic to secure it in place first. One option for that is hand basting. I can line up the center line of my elastic with the very edge of my fabric, and I can put a simple running stitch in. I want to put that stitch very close to the edge of my fabric, very close to the center of the elastic. This way it holds it in place without being in the way when you go to stitch that elastic into place. And as I go around corners, I will also have to stretch the elastic just slightly to get it to sit flat, though I do want to make sure I don't stretch it too much or it'll cause the fabric to gather. So here is my basting stitch very near to the edge of my fabric, and when I fold the elastic over, I can stitch down this edge of the elastic without stitching my basting stitch into place. I can also put a basting stitch in with my machine. If I put my machine on a straight stitch at the longest stitch length available to me and I don't back stitch, I can again stitch very close to the edge of the fabric, right near the center of the elastic. I'm lining up that center line in the elastic with the edge of my fabric and stretching just slightly because I'm going around a corner here as I go. And then I have this lovely basting stitch here, which again is out of the way. When I stitch the elastic down on the very edge of the elastic, I won't stitch my basting into place, and I can come back and remove that later if I would like to. So I've tacked it in place now with a straight stitch at 2.5, so that's my finished stitch, and then I can pull my basting stitch out. in large sections if I'm going all the way around the saddle skirt, or in this case, because it's just a little demonstration piece, I can pull the whole basting stitch out in one go and I'm left with this nice clean finished edge. I can also secure my fold over in place with pins. If I'm using pins to secure the fold over elastic, I like to turn them this way because I find it's much easier to remove the pins as you go down the edge of the fabric. And I feel it does a really good job of holding the elastic exactly where I want it on the fabric. I only pin a small section at a time, so I will pin 2, 4 pins, and when I get to the last pin I have in place, I'll put in a few more pins and carry on. I don't like to pin the whole garment with something as large as a saddle skirt because then it falls down into your lap and you end up poked by pins. If you prefer craft clips to pins, you can do exactly the same thing. I would still do it a small section at the time so I didn't have to worry about the clips getting knocked off by the weight of the fabric dragging on the table, but you can certainly clip it into place and then stitch. You can also just place as you go. So lots of folks won't secure their fold over elastic before they start sewing. They'll simply fold it over the edge of your fabric, lining up the center line with the edge of the fabric, and stitch it into place. Again, as I go around the corner, I do have to stretch it just slightly, but I want to make sure I don't overstretch it because that'll cause gathering. This place as you go method, you do have to be a little more careful, especially if you're not used to it. It's much easier to miss the back side of your elastic, especially if you're using a straight stitch right close to the edge. And it's also much easier to accidentally overstretch your elastic as you sew, and then you get this effect where it's gathered together. Now sometimes we'll intentionally gather things with fold over that way, but not for the saddle skirt. We'd prefer it to sit nice and flat. So to avoid this gathering, we want to make sure we don't stretch our elastic too much as we sew. And you can also use a zigzag stitch or one of the stretch stitches available on your machine because they're much wider and you're more sure to catch the back of the elastic than with an edge stitch. So when you get all the way around your saddle skirt and you come to where you started with the fold over, you have a couple of ways that you can finish with fold over elastic. You can certainly clip the end nice and tidy and run the other end of your elastic right over top. So I encase that raw edge where I started in this elastic where I'm finishing. And then I run my elastic right off the edge of my piece. And I will stitch right off the edge of the piece and continue stitching down the elastic a short way and pull it out of my machine, leaving a tail. So here's my little tail, and I can take my little tail and tuck it around behind the back side of my piece, and then I can simply stitch it down and tack it in place. Once I've got my little tail tacked into place, I can clip it off and clean up my threads, and then I'm done. My saddle skirt is bound. It does show a little more on the back than other methods, but it's a perfectly great way, and it is the least finicky way I've found to finish fold over elastic. So quick and easy. A nice way to go. Clean up my threads, and we'll have a look at the finished product. So there you have it. The other nice way to finish fold over elastic is with an angled seam. So here I'm putting my tails of my fold over elastic right sides together, right in the middle of the gap between the two ends of the stitching, and I'm pinning it into place. I've got my elastic pieces at a 90-degree angle to each other, so they're forming a cross, and I've got them pinned right at the point where they meet in the center of the gap on the fabric where the elastic has not been secured yet. And then I'm going to run a basting stitch. I'm going to make an X with where I currently have that pin and run a simple basting stitch from corner to corner on the square where those two elastics overlap. So the little square formed by the elastics overlapping, I'm just running a diagonal basting stitch. And then I can double check that I have my seam placement where I want it, that my elastic length is going to be good, and I can take it to my machine and stitch it. Then I can remove that basting stitch, trim up the ends of my elastic, and when I fold it over, I know it's going to fit nicely in place. And there you have it. You just stitch it down and you've finished the binding on your saddle skirt.